Are Algeria and Morocco heading towards war? Why is the United States opposed to self-determination in Western Sahara? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute's interview program on current events, policy questions, and new ideas. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Samia Errazzouki. Samia Errazzouki is a doctoral candidate in history at the University of California, Davis. She was previously a journalist with the Associated Press and Reuters in Morocco, where she also worked as a research associate with the University of Cambridge, researching the dynamics of surveillance and citizen media in the region. Samia is also a co-editor of Jadaliyya. Samia Errazzouki, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
This August, Algeria severed diplomatic relations with Morocco. Tensions have been increasing steadily between the two countries since, with some warning it could even result in armed hostilities between the two states. What is the background to this crisis, and where do you see it heading?
So the recent escalation has been sort of a culmination of a number of developments, most of which could lead back to 1963, when Morocco and Algeria were at war over a territorial dispute in the south.
This is a sand war.
Right. But more recently, however, it has escalated following Trump's proclamation in which he recognized the Western Sahara as being under Moroccan sovereignty in exchange for Morocco normalizing ties with Israel. Since then, there has been a steady sort of breakdown of ties between Morocco and Algeria that were already tenuous to begin with. Now, the borders have historically been closed since the 90s, severing communities that have existed along the border of Morocco and Algeria, and interrupting a huge amount of trade and commerce between the two countries. But in August, what happened was there were a series of major wildfires in Algeria, in the Kabyle region in the east. And the Algerian government officially blamed Kabyle separatist groups for being behind the fires. Now, Algeria also accuses Morocco of arming these groups, and the Algerian government claimed to have seized some weapons from this group, which they again claim that Morocco backs them. Whether or not that's true, there's no evidence for it. But at the same time, while this was happening, a Moroccan diplomat called for the self-determination of the Kabyle people, sort of a response to Algeria's position when it comes to the Western Sahara. So in response, Algeria recalled its ambassador. And at the same time this was unfolding, Morocco was engulfed in relatively international wide-scale scandal regarding allegations that it was spying on a number of foreign dignitaries, among them Algerian officials and French President Emmanuel Macron, in addition to another.
And a number of cabinet ministers.
Right. So that was sort of like the lead up to August. And since August, there have been a number of developments. Several Moroccan truck drivers, who are in the commercial trade between Morocco and West Africa, were found killed in Mali. Morocco accused Algeria of carrying out those killings. And then more recently, 3 Algerian truck drivers in the buffer zone in the Western Sahara in the south were killed. And now the circumstances of their deaths have still been unofficially they haven't been officially confirmed because access to that region is extremely limited. So allegations have been, going all about, from drone strike to, the trucks were just caught on fire. But Algeria has pointed officially the finger to Morocco. Morocco has not responded to these allegations. And then there have also been a series of skirmishes along the border, primarily between the Polisario Front and the Moroccan army, though there have been reports that Algerian soldiers have been involved in these skirmishes.
This is in the Tindouf region.
This is along the border with Morocco and Algeria as well. I mean, there have been some reports that these skirmishes have gone much further up north than they're used to taking place. Not like they are. In fact, these skirmishes are relatively unprecedented when it comes to the past 30 or so years of the ceasefire that has been put in place.
But so this time also on the Algerian-Moroccan border, and not only the border between Algeria and Western Sahara.
Those are the reports, again, because of the very limited and constrained access to the region. A lot of these reports have not been corroborated. And this has been sort of one of the recurring issues when it comes to news coverage on this conflict, is that access is limited. And even, UN officials, for example, find themselves very limited in their ability to actually go and see for themselves. And so this is part of the issue, more broadly speaking.
You mentioned the Trump administration's recognition of Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara as one of the background factors to the escalation in Algerian-Moroccan tensions. But now turning specifically to Western Sahara, that conflict, as you mentioned, a ceasefire and diplomatic stalemate has reigned there for almost 3 decades, since 1991. But it has in the past year also seen a significant escalation. And as you mentioned, this has been further exacerbated by Washington's endorsement of Morocco's annexation of the territory to reward Rabat for recognizing Israel. What impact have these developments had on the prospect for self-determination for Western Sahara?
So it has been extremely consequential. Now, initially, when this proclamation came out, interestingly enough, it solicited widespread condemnation on both sides of the aisle.
In late 2019, early 2020, I believe.
Correct. So even members of the Republican Party, including Senator Inhofe, John Bolton, were among the leading voices to condemn this decision. And since the beginning of Biden's administration, they have also been at the forefront of advocating for a reversal on this decision. Now, officially, the Biden administration has chosen to sort of neither confirm nor deny this position. So they're neither upholding it officially, nor are they overturning it. And this has left a huge sort of cloud of ambiguity when it comes to the US's position. And the reason why it's significant is because the US is the penholder for the UN Security Council resolution that renews the peacekeeping mission in the Western Sahara every year. It just recently passed.
And so, if I may, I should also add that none of Morocco's other traditional allies, like, for example, France, have endorsed Morocco's claims of sovereignty over Western Sahara. Absolutely. I believe the UAE opened a consular mission in Ayoun or something to that effect. But
well, so they had announced that they were going to open a consulate. Now, whether or not that actually has been the case, I haven't seen any reports of an actual opening of a consulate. And it was very similar to sort of the US announcement, right? They nominally inaugurated an office in Dakhla, but officially now the US does have a position that they're not opening a consulate in the Western Sahara, and that's a major development. But essentially what it did is, it forced the US outside of being in this position of sort of like a neutral, peacemaker. Though historically the US has generally supported Morocco, at least, militarily speaking. And so what this has done is the stakes have become higher, essentially. And what this has done was provide a basis for a resumption of hostilities. And so the Polisario recently announced that the ceasefire is over, and has actively been engaging in various military confrontations with the Moroccan army in the south. And on the other hand, Morocco is very keen on making sure that eyes are on Algeria as a major party in this conflict, a position that Algeria categorically refuses to accept. Algeria's position is that this is a conflict between Morocco and the Polisario front. That's as much as we can say on it.
If I may, Algeria's position is basically that this is a question of decolonization. Morocco's position is that this is a question of national sovereignty. But also the military escalation in Western Sahara, I believe, briefly preceded the Moroccan-Israeli agreement. and there were already escalating protests and skirmishes already in October, November 2019, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, even before in 2017, actually. So when I was reporting with Reuters, this was one of the stories that I was covering, which was the tensions around Morocco claiming that it was repaving a road in Guergueres, which is a buffer zone technically. No armed military forces from either side are allowed. And when the Polisario raised the alarm, Morocco said, oh, this is a civilian mission. We're just clearing the road so that our truck drivers can make it safely to West Africa for commerce. It turned out that eventually Morocco set up a checkpoint and an outpost there in Guergueres. And that was sort of the beginning of those confrontations that followed up and preceded the normalization. But that's another point that I wanted to sort of go back to about Israel and Morocco, is that this normalization is very nominal. I mean, historically, Morocco and Israel have had enduring ties.
Since the 60s.
Since the 60s, I mean, notoriously, and we can now confirm for a fact, this used to be a rumor, but because of declassified documents, that King Hassan II, bugged a meeting of the Arab League leading up to the 1967 war and provided the contents of that meeting to the Israeli intelligence agency. And so this is just one of many examples of enduring ties between Morocco and Israel. Also, the fact that there is this significant Moroccan Jewish population in Israel that travels frequently back and forth for pilgrimage. So travel is, not restricted between the countries. They've had enduring ties. And so this normalization is very surface level. I mean, aside from setting up an actual, they're calling it a liaison office, not even an embassy. There's nothing really much in substance there. It's not like sort of Israeli ties with Gulf countries, with Bahrain or the UAE, for example.
It's a formalization of an existing reality.
Exactly. So this exchange, this transaction, if you will, Morocco didn't have to put that much in it, is the point here. And it received a reward that it had been vying for decades, but one that perhaps they miscalculated was going to be the outcome. As you mentioned, no other major country followed suit in terms of recognizing this position. And that was perhaps one of the cards that they miscalculated as being a result of this. And now, as I mentioned earlier, the Biden administration is taking this position of, we're just going to endorse the appointment of the new UN special envoy and let him do his work. Their position is that if they either, overturn or reinforce that Trump proclamation, that it will be seen as an obstacle one way or another for getting the parties to resume negotiations. And so yesterday, actually, there was an official meeting between Morocco's foreign minister, Nasser Bourita, and Antony Blinken in DC, where, the statement from the State Department referenced the Western Sahara as its own. And that kind of can be seen as, okay, well, we're just going to resume the US's historical position before the Trump proclamation. So pretending like it just didn't happen.
But I should add that it's maybe worth pointing out that the international position on Western Sahara, the International Court of Justice, already in the 1970s issued an advisory opinion that the people, the Sahrawi people, are entitled to self-determination. And much of the conflict since has been about whether and how such a referendum in Western Sahara will be organized. And the US has had kind of this double policy, as you mentioned. On the one hand, de facto supporting Morocco in its confrontation with the Polisario Front, but at the same time also investing in efforts to find a diplomatic solution to this conflict by, for example, appointing senior American diplomats as UN envoys and so on.
Right, James Baker, Christopher Ross. I would also add that, the official acronym for the UN peacekeeping mission in Western Sahara is MINURSO. The R stands for the referendum. So the primary mandate of the UN peacekeeping mission
To organize a
is
referendum.
to organize a referendum. And as you mentioned, so there has just been a complete stalling over the question of who can vote in this referendum. And that has been at the center of the reason why this referendum hasn't happened. Now, the issue is that the more time goes on, the people that were once eligible to vote and participate in this referendum, unfortunately are aging or passing away, leading way to more sort of convoluted questions of having to contend with the fact that there are now we're 3 or 4 generations in to Sahrawis being born in exile and in displacement and the refugee camps in southern Algeria. And that's an added layer to the sort of the human cost of this, which is hundreds of thousands of Sahrawi refugees have been living in very harsh conditions in Tindouf. And so that's sort of, a major point that I think shouldn't get lost in this discussion, because it's the true human cost. I mean, these families have been cut off from their homes and from their own families, right, in the Western Sahara. So that's a very important point to highlight. But absolutely, so with all of these developments, it's becoming increasingly, the reality that the chances of this referendum happening are increasingly slim.
And diminishing.
And exponentially diminishing, yeah.
Turning back to Algeria for a moment, Algeria's relations with another state, namely the former colonial power, France, continue to be a matter of contention. Last month, French President Emmanuel Macron denounced the October 1961 massacre of hundreds of Algerian demonstrators in Paris, when bodies were thrown into the Seine and so on, but pointedly stopped short of offering an official apology for this massacre. He then added insult to injury by going so far as to question whether Algeria even existed before French colonization. Algeria, as you know, promptly recalled its ambassador from Paris and closed its airspace to French military traffic. At the same time, others suggest that Algeria's current government is in fact heavily dependent on French support in various forms. So the question becomes, is there a genuine crisis in French-Algerian relations?
So at the heart of this question, it's not just that Algeria's current government relies heavily on French, but France relies heavily on Algeria in many ways. I mean, migration population, for example. Algerian migrants are the backbone of the French economy. And so in terms of there being a genuine crisis, every few years, this question flares up between Algeria and France. It was something that preceding President François Hollande found himself having to contend with as well. So I believe he was the first to actually recognize that the October 1961 massacre even happened. And
also stopped short of an apology, I should add.
Right. Yes, absolutely. And so I think the major contextual point here is that it's an election season in France. And so I think this is more reflective of, French political dynamics in light of the presidential campaign that's unfolding. Because every time there's a major presidential campaign, this question of France recognizing its colonization of Algeria comes up. And so I think it's more reflective of that. Though, however, France historically has been a staunch supporter of Morocco. That has kind of diminished in some ways. And there's a number of events that led up to that. So the first thing that happened was when Macron was elected president, his first official visit was to Morocco. And it was at the height of the protests that were unfolding in Morocco's northern Rif region, known as the Hirak. And during his visit in Morocco, President Emmanuel Macron delivered a press conference where he was asked about whether or not these protests came up in his conversations with King Mohammed VI of Morocco. And then he sort of took a position of almost speaking on behalf of the king. And that was sort of seen as a major transgression, not just because the king has himself hadn't spoken on it, but, you know, here we have the French president speaking on behalf of the King of Morocco. That was one thing. Another has been the surveillance spyware scandal that I mentioned earlier. So among the major stories was that Morocco was accused of spying on the French president, as well as a number of French government officials and French journalists and activists.
Sorry, so this was Morocco using Israeli spyware, Pegasus and whatever, to spy on French officials at the highest level of state. But the reason why they did so has never been clarified. Was this related to Western Sahara or relations with Algeria?
Morocco has been at the forefront of taking advantage of this emerging market of high-grade surveillance. And this isn't the first time that Morocco has used surveillance technologies well beyond its borders. First case was back in 2012, which we can discuss later. But so Morocco has not officially even recognized that it in fact has categorically denied these allegations and has launched defamation lawsuits in France. Though, as far as I understand, though, my knowledge of French law is very limited, that there's a specific article that prevents foreign governments from filing defamation lawsuits in France. So I'm not quite sure how far that's going to get. But no official reason was truly given, and we can posit, we can make guesses. I think it's just that Morocco has been able to successfully use this strategy of surveillance with impunity, and as so long as it's not facing any consequences, it'll continue to do so, especially because it perhaps is an effective way to gather intelligence and information. You don't have to send any officers on the field. You just press a button and listen and watch. And this is one of, I think, the major reasons why France has sort of taken a step back in its at least public position in being a strong advocate for Morocco. And I think this sort of fits in with the dynamic of this sort of triangle between Morocco, Algeria, and France. And historically, France has always been very outspoken in defending and supporting Morocco's position, whether it's on the Western Sahara or whether it's, supporting Morocco as a way to sort of nudge Algeria. But that hasn't been the case. Now, again, it could be because, domestic politics are reigning supreme right now. Officials are more concerned with elections.
Sorry, are you here referring to the votes of French citizens of Algerian background?
I'm referring to sort of elections in France in general, the presidential elections.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be interesting to see how these dynamics unfold following the elections. And I think that will provide us with insight about how genuine these issues are between the two. And to what extent do you think energy politics comes into this? I mean, as part of the tensions between Morocco and Algeria, Algeria has shut down a gas pipeline that has led to energy supply issues in Spain. But if we look at France, I believe France is one of the main purchasers of Algerian hydrocarbons. So to what extent may that also account for what you see as a potential shift in French North African policy? Yeah, so the point of the gas pipeline is super important. I'm glad you raised it. There's this pipeline that supplies gas to both Morocco and Spain. So it's
right.
The
traverses
Europe
Morocco,
and it goes from Algeria to Morocco to Spain.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the context of these escalating tensions between Morocco and Algeria announced it was going to cease supplying gas through that pipeline and provide Spain with gas directly, essentially removing Morocco from the equation ahead of the cold winter season. Now, Morocco is not a country rich in energy resources, so this is definitely going to have significant ramifications. But so the fact that Algeria is able to just continue supplying its European allies directly makes Morocco a little bit sort of disposable in that relationship. And so I definitely see that Algeria, and this has been historic, right? Algeria has a huge trove of natural resources, which is able to use in shaping its policies and using it as leverage in navigating its relationship with its European allies, specifically its former colonizing power, France. So that's absolutely a huge component of it. And again, ahead of the winter season, right? If it's not already cold enough there.
Right. So this will be an issue for both Morocco and European countries, which are already dealing with a potential energy crisis.
Right.
If we turn back now to Morocco held parliamentary elections this past September, and the parliamentary elections rather, and these saw the Islamist Justice and Development Party, the PJD, ousted from government for the first time since 2011. And it had been either leading or a coalition partner in government for an entire decade. And the surprising winner of these elections and the current prime minister is Aziz Khanouch, one of Morocco and indeed Africa's wealthiest businessmen. So the question becomes, has the election had a significant impact on Moroccan politics and government policy? Or is this a question where you're really dealing with the state structure in which the key factor is an executive monarchy and royal court, and in which governments have only limited leeway in setting policy?
So my brief sort of really concise response to that would be that the election of Aziz Khanouch is officially the consummation of the marriage between palace and the wealthiest sectors of the private sector in Morocco. So let me take a step back here, because there's so much that is worth highlighting.
And if I can add, Khanouch was also a coalition member in the previous Islamist.
The longest serving minister of agriculture and fisheries in Moroccan history. He was the only member of the cabinet to maintain his position after the 2011 elections following the February 20th movement. And he was able to do so by resigning from his party. And then he only recently returned, it was the 2016 elections that he returned to his party, the National Rally of Independence, itself founded by an extended member of the royal family, Ahmed Osman, back a few decades ago. But so the PJD has essentially been incapacitated as a political party following its victory in 2016. And this took place in the form of the king essentially firing Abd Ibn Kiran, the former prime minister and the secretary general of the PJD, and appointing Saadettin Othmani in his stead. And one of the reasons for why this happened was because Ibn Kiran refused to form a coalition with Aziz Khanouch's party.
You have it.
And lo and behold, I think just a matter of days after Othmani was appointed, it was announced that Aziz Khanouch's party was going to be a member of the coalition. This was in 2016. And so there's that dynamic. And then there's also the fact that Aziz Khanouch is not only wealthy businessman, one of the wealthiest businessmen, second only to the king, but he's also a very close personal friend of the king. A few years ago, there was always reports of the king and his wife going to have iftar with Aziz Khanouch and his wife, Salwa Khanouch, also a significant figure in the private sector in Morocco. She essentially holds a monopoly on almost every single major clothing franchise in Morocco, Zara, Mango, all of the big names. And she's also the CEO, founder of the Morocco Mall, biggest mall in Africa. So we get a sense of the dynamics that are unfolding here. But Aziz Khanouch's wealth comes from his investment and his holdings in the energy sector. Afriqiya gas station. Now, any of the folks that are watching have been to Morocco within the past 5 or 6 years, you're driving down the highway, whether you're going from Tanja all the way down to Marrakech, there's only one gas station you will always see on the highway, and that's Ifriqiya, and that belongs to Aziz Akhnouch. So, Moroccans are very conscious and aware of his public presence, and not just as an official, but as a businessman. And this prompted a huge boycott a few years ago, where it was a leaderless movement that started on social media, but the goal was to launch a boycott of specific companies. One of them was Ifriqiya, belonging to Aziz Akhnouch. So the fact that he has been elected and appointed as prime minister, I think, takes the veil off of this illusion that this government is in some ways, representative of, some
Parliament or public opinion.
Right. It's not. I mean, it's subservient to the palace, but in this case, we can now characterize it as a partner of the palace. It's very much going to be a government that is not ever going to be in a position to challenge or push back against any royal decisions. The previous government was completely subservient. I mean, here we saw with the whole announcement of the normalization deal with Israel, Saadin Othmani, left out of the dark multiple times, found making statements that he ended up having to sort of swallow a few months later. And so this current government, I think, just really cements what many folks have been saying, which is that this government is an extension of royal authority, and that it does not serve to represent the will of the people, that parliament is a shell. Perhaps some have even gone so far as to say a waste of public funding. That's sort of what this election, I think, has shown. And the interesting thing is also, in one of the victories that won in terms of the elections, not just that, but he also won the elections to be mayor of Agadir. So he's also a prime minister of Morocco and a mayor of Agadir. And to my knowledge, I'm not sure that there's a precedent, at least in recent history, of the prime minister also holding on to a local electoral position. In addition to the fact that he is still, I think there was a statement that he issued that he was no longer going to be involved with making decisions in his private holding company.
We have precedents for that as well. Does he have
surely do.
Son named Don Jr.? But at the same time, I mean, you seem to be suggesting that the palace or the powers that be engineered the ouster of the PJD from government, but other people have suggested that the Islamists had also so consistently failed in their decade of governance that they were simply unable to muster popular support and even significant elements of their core base to once again vote for them.
Look, the PJD knew that by virtue of taking on this position of being a leading political party, that their mandate was going to be limited. Mm-hmm. There's no qualms about that. I mean, and I think the first statement that Abdel bin Kiran made when he was appointed prime minister in 2011 was to say, "The king is my boss." And this was after he had established, a reputation for being a relatively fierce critic of, figures who were seen as being cronies of the palace, namely Fouad Ali Himma, who was currently senior advisor to the king. But what happened, I mean, let me clarify. I'm not trying to say that there was like an actual coup or ousting, but that over the course of the past decade, the palace has steadily subsumed the political capital of the PJD, and drawing upon its popularity and essentially just wringing it dry. And
the PJD was a willing participant in its assisted suicide.
Absolutely. This is part of the equation that comes with being, a major political party in Morocco. And it's happened to previous political parties. The USFP in the 90s, also seen as sort of like the progressive and, this will be sort of the government that kind of maybe changes things. Here we are a few years later. So, but this is the cycle of political history in Morocco. The palace is able to maintain its power and influence by, incorporating this political capital from other parties and monopolizing it and making sure that no one political party dominates. That's the most important thing. And that was perhaps where the PJD went wrong, I would say almost, is that they were too popular. I mean, the myth of Icarus here is quite apropos. I think they flew too close to the sun. And it was in the fact that like Ben Kidane was emerging as, a major political figure, almost at the level of sort of, competing with that of the kings. That ended up being his downfall.
Samia, to turn once again to regional affairs, I'd like to ask you, to what extent are other crises in the Maghreb, such as Libya and now also Tunisia, and in the Sahel region, having an impact on the domestic politics of either or both Algeria and Morocco?
Oh, I think it's definitely a two-way street. I think it's these crises having an impact on both Algerian and Moroccan politics, but the other way around, that the dynamics between Morocco and Algeria also having an impact on these regional crises. So Tunisia, for example, they're a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, surprised everyone, including especially Morocco, when it abstained from voting in the UN Security Council vote to renew MINURSO. Many pundits in the Maghreb, primarily in Algeria and Tunisia, pointed to the fact that this signifies maybe Tunisia shifting a little bit more closer towards Algeria. And then earlier, there was what I mentioned about the series of, deaths of truck drivers in West Africa and in the Sahara region as well, on both sides, right? Both of whom are accusing each other. And then you have Libya, of course. Now, Morocco has been at the forefront of, really pushing this narrative of being a peacemaker with the various parties in Libya. Morocco hosted the Khairat negotiations, which led to, a deal which we can now see what fate it was met with. But also recently, I believe Morocco is also a party of the Libya negotiations that are unfolding in Berlin. And Algeria traditionally, historically, has always taken a position of, we're not going to interfere in any of these affairs, though anything that we could do to contribute to mediation, of course. But Algeria hasn't been very sort of upfront to the same degree that Morocco has when it comes to Libya. But that's not entirely the case with the Sahel, especially in Mali. And both Morocco and Algeria have in various forms kind of bankrolled, supported various factions and groups. But ultimately, what I think is happening right now is that whatever dynamic is unfolding between Morocco and Algeria is going to have ramifications elsewhere in the region. And this is also why the question of the Western Sahara is so integral, because it is at the heart of this problem between Morocco and Algeria. And so long as this question of the Western Sahara remains unresolved, and especially, as long as these confrontations continue to escalate without, much condemnation from the international community, we get, the very frequent, we call on all sides to sort of calm down from the UN, but no concrete measures, sanctions even, have been implemented, considering the fact that people are dying. I mean, there have been a number of civilian deaths so far outside of the realm of like of military soldiers. So I think ultimately, so long as this conflict remains unresolved, we're going to see it manifest in various forms, among which are going to be ongoing tensions between Morocco and Algeria. Now we have the UN envoy. It's look, historically, UN envoys on the Western Sahara have been facing a very limited mandate. Now, the last one who was able to somewhat successfully propose a plan was James Baker.
Baker, yeah, and that was in the early 90s.
And that was in the early 90s. And his plan was unanimously adopted by the Security Council, by Algeria, by the Polisario, not Morocco. And so it's interesting, actually, because Morocco's sort of refusal to adopt that plan has kind of sowed this, the sentiment among those that were part of that process, including John Bolton, right? He worked with James Baker.
Right.
And so, he kind of saw firsthand, and you talk to,
well, he's personally invested, I get the impression from
yes,
his,
and I recently spoke to Christopher Ross, who's a former UN envoy for the Western Sahara, and he is of the mind that Morocco, if there's anyone to blame for why no progress has been made, it's Morocco. The reason being that one of the conditions, directives of the UN Security Council is that the parties participate in negotiations without preconditions. That Morocco only agrees to participate in talks if it's only its autonomy plan that's discussed,
right.
If Algeria is part of the talks. So there's also, without going too much into the nitty gritty of it, but there's this contention over, the roundtable talks versus like the direct talks. Morocco is very much, no, Algeria needs to be part of these conversations. Algeria says no. And then even when they do manage to get Algeria to participate, from what I hear from folks, Algeria just kind of remains mum and doesn't really actively participate in the conversations. So the current envoy is going to have a lot on his plate.
Well, I mean, he's a clown even before he gets out his plate. I really wouldn't.
Right, and I think ultimately it's going to be up to the UN Security Council to back up the envoy and to provide him with the support to be able to do what his mandate calls for, which is to work towards, establishing a referendum. But
I'm afraid that'll require a different and more effective envoy. But that notwithstanding, Samia, finally, I'd like to return to a subject you've addressed earlier, and also something that you were involved with as a researcher in Morocco, namely surveillance and also citizen media. What significance do you see in terms of the use of these surveillance activities? I mean, especially if you look at North African countries, they have a history of very intensive surveillance of their citizens long before electronic measures and NSO and all the rest of it even existed. So what has been the impact and significance of the kinds of technologies that we're seeing today?
Yeah, I mean, just a disclaimer, it wasn't just research that I did. I was part of a citizen media collective called Memfekinch.
I see.
And we were targeted with surveillance in 2012.
Well, then you're the perfect person to answer this question.
Right. So it was software, it was spyware that was purchased from an Italian-based company called Hacking Team. And Morocco initially denied it. WikiLeaks subsequently published emails that proved otherwise. And there were no major consequences. Like I mentioned earlier, this question of impunity, the fact that nothing happened to Morocco. And then, of course, more recently, the allegations of them purchasing and using Israeli NSO group spyware, Pegasus, also used on a number of, used by other countries, dictatorships, regimes in the region and elsewhere in the world. So when it comes to Morocco, there's one particular, event, and I think, so the rise of Abdelatif al-Hammouchi as a senior, and not just I would argue the senior security chief in Morocco. Now, Abdelatif al-Hammouchi got his start as the head of Morocco's domestic intelligence agency. And then over the course of the past few years was also appointed as the head of the National Police Force. Now, while he nominally serves under the Minister of Interior, Minister of Interiors have come and gone, and he's only risen and gained more influence. And
Well, his predecessor, I think, was in office for several decades as well.
right, and so here's the thing is that Abdulatif Hamouchi oversees a security apparatus that exists outside of the oversight of any other institution. So we could have elections, ministers, what have you, but this security apparatus answers solely to the palace. And over the course of the past few years, especially beginning 2011, we have seen this significant ballooning of the security apparatus under Abdulatif Hamouchi. And this also coincided with the rise of ISIS. So when there were a series of attacks in Europe, oftentimes you would hear reports that among the suspects were Moroccans. And so this became significant for Morocco to become involved with intelligence gathering and providing intelligence with European allies by saying, listen, we have all of the intelligence, we'll give it to you. And this was, I had interviewed Abdelhak Al-Khayyam, the former director of, what they call Morocco's FBI, modeled after the FBI. In fact, when I was interviewing, right behind him, he had a certificate from a training he did in Quantico. But he was very much of the mind that, it is because of us and the intelligence that we have given to European allies that we have managed to foil, other attacks. Right. So the combination of sort of like the authoritarian regression post-Arab Spring, plus the rise of ISIS, has given Abdulatif Hamouchi oversight over this unprecedentedly major security apparatus that exists in Morocco, and that's becoming increasingly technologically advanced. And so one of the things that he has done under his mandate has been to put up surveillance cameras all over the country and to digitize police records, basically the shift to better sort of police technology using these programs and softwares. And surveillance softwares have been integral in this. Yeah. And surveillance is very much part and parcel of policing in Morocco. And it's not even just the police who are involved in surveillance. So I had recall, I did an interview with a security specialist when I was working in Morocco as a journalist. And one of the questions that I kept asking was, Morocco has managed to avoid any major ISIS attacks, when that wasn't the case for elsewhere in the region, especially considering the fact that Moroccan foreign fighters or ISIS were among, the top 3 sources of foreign nationals of ISIS. And this person told me, everyone is just watching each other. Like the chance for that happening are impossible. And like this idea is institutionalized in the Ministry of Interior with the position of the Muqaddam. The Muqaddam is literally someone who has been assigned a part of this, like a neighborhood, and his sole responsibility is to watch everything. Who's coming, who's going. So policing and surveillance are embedded within the fabric of Moroccan society and even institutionalized within the Ministry of Interior. And so, it seems very natural that this path would be the one that they go down by using surveillance. And the fact is because it's effective. They're able to gather an immense amount of information. And lo and behold, a lot of that information has been used to imprison and jail activists and journalists. And, to gather information that could be used in a way that, gets at the heart of this question of morality. So a lot of these journalists and activists who have been imprisoned and faced charges have faced charges for, of sexual and moral, of a sexual and moral nature, not because of their work. And a lot of this stems from the fact that, this information was gathered through surveillance. And lo and behold, a lot of those activists and journalists were revealed by a number of organizations to have been under surveillance, especially recently with the Pegasus spyware. So But then there's another layer to this, which is, something that I still haven't been able to wrap my head around, which is that one of the reports that emerged is that Al-Hamoushi, Abdul-Latif Hamoushi, had targeted the king himself with surveillance.
Ah.
And this is quite damning of an allegation. Now, I don't think that
And he's still in office.
Still, right? And so that's the thing is like, any other country, the head of the intelligence is accused of spying on the head of state, some sort
He's
of
either fired or becomes a head of state.
or just disappears. But that was not the case, not even an investigation, and that's a serious allegation, especially considering that for many people, they would characterize that Morocco has descended into, a level of being a police state in unprecedented ways, especially in light of the COVID pandemic. I mean, Morocco has one of the strictest lockdown restrictions in the region, curfews, people not being able to travel outside of their neighborhoods. I remember when the COVID restrictions were first implemented, the Ministry of Interior used to regularly publish the arrest records of those that were arrested for violating lockdown restrictions. And I think once it got to almost 9,000, they stopped publishing that information. Many people that I've spoken to that have gone to Morocco recently and or live in Morocco, obviously, have said that it feels extremely restrictive. And so I think this is, the culmination of what happens when the head of your security apparatus is able to essentially,
unbridled power with impunity.
Right. Yep.
It's a brave new world. Samia Errazzouki, I'd really like to thank you for sharing your expertise and insights with Connections. It's been an extremely informative discussion.
Thank you.
Our next episode will be with Mark Taylor, speaking on war economies and international law on December 8th. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.